deserves to receive quality education. Education is a basic human right, but most of disabled children in Africa are being denied access to it. Research shows that only around 2% of disabled children across the continent are attending school. This isn't good enough, and it must change. But how? We shall be talking about inclusive education in our program today. My name is Winnie Onyimbo, and you're listening to Transworld Radio Kenya. Around the world, children are excluded from schools because of disability, race, tribe, religion, gender, and poverty. Children with disabilities are the most violated in this regard. In Africa, they are mostly hidden at home. They hardly ever access education, and when they do, they go to special schools with other children who have disabilities. African governments, Kenya included, signed the United Nations Convention on Disability Rights, committing the full inclusion of all disabled children in mainstream education. Kenya then introduced free primary education for all children. But just attending school does not mean that a disabled child or any child is necessarily accessing a quality educational experience. I spoke to Dr. Emmanuel Manyasa of Uwezo Kenya, an initiative that aims to improve competencies in literacy and numeracy among children in East Africa, who says that for free education to be inclusive, it must attempt to meet the needs of all learners.
We have more children accessing school. The key question to ask is whether that access is meaningful, whether they are actually learning. And our research has shown that they are accessing but not learning to the level they should be learning. The second thing that one needs to think about also is, even as government ensures that there is free and compulsory primary education, yet we still have about 6% of children who should be in school not in school. And the reason they are not in school are factors beyond school fees, factors at home. And so there are other things that need to be done, especially components of the compulsory part of the government policy, which are not being implemented. I want us to focus on learning outcomes and not on access, because access is good, but it is not an end in itself. It's supposed to be a means to learning. If it doesn't lead to learning, then it is not just a burden to the family, but to the government as well, which is spending so much on keeping children in school, especially if it doesn't deliver anything for the investment being put in.
Divya Lata is an early childhood specialist with UNICEF in Uganda. She's an advocate for inclusive education. Inclusive education means diverse students learning side by side in the same classroom. This system of learning celebrates differences. So how did it begin? I had a one-on-one interview with Divya about inclusive or integrated education in the early years of school. Divya gives us a bit of a background of how it began and explains what inclusive education is.
Typically, special schools were, in the 50s, 60s, they had become quite prevalent, particularly bringing the attention to education needs of children with disabilities. And the idea there was basically that, children who actually were denied any access to education, to bring them into the education system. At that point, it was considered that it may be better for them to be in a special school because they will probably get more specialized support. There will probably be fewer children per teacher, so they will get individualized attention. And overall, it was considered that in mainstream settings, teachers would probably find it hard to deal with the whole range of abilities, taking the children who are regular classroom goers and also looking at children with disabilities within that. However, over a period of time, what has become quite clear is that children with disabilities actually thrive better in inclusive settings, especially if those settings have been adapted to meet their needs and to really address the specific needs they might have. So, first of all, for a child to learn, there are many sources of that learning that is happening. Of course, the teacher is somebody who sets up the classroom, to a large extent determines what kind of activities will happen there. But children learn not only from adults, they learn also from their peers. And to a great extent, the interaction that the child has with the peers is a very useful and a part of the environment in which the child is learning. So, when children have a more diverse classroom, where children with disabilities, maybe different abilities, are together with children who may not have any visible impairment, they actually are being exposed to a whole range of role models in learning. And that, I think, is a very important part of what an inclusive classroom offers to a child. The second thing is it has also been seen that the special schools are relatively more expensive to run, maintain, and in fact this idea that they may actually provide more specialized support does not always turn out in reality. Because they are so expensive to do, special schools are very few and far between, and some studies have shown that barely about 1 to 2% of children who need special education or any kind of special support in learning really get access if we are trying to disaggregate children with disabilities into a special setting as opposed to including them. On the other hand, if we are able to actually equip mainstream schools with the possibility of including these diverse abilities, then they offer a better possibility that many more children will actually have access to education.
In a proper inclusive school setting, every child feels safe and has a sense of belonging. It is about how we develop and design our schools, classrooms, programs, and activities so that all children learn and participate together. Many mainstream primary schools in Africa lack some important materials and resources which would make the inclusion of disabled children easier. Teachers are in charge of classes of more than 50 students, and most times they lack the training and skills to meaningfully include disabled children in their classrooms. So how can teachers make the classroom an inclusive environment on a limited budget? Divya has some innovative ideas that may not even require a lot of money.
Of course, these classrooms need to then be prepared for children with disabilities. So one aspect of that is to what extent is the physical environment adapted to for their needs. Of course, we probably know the accessibility for physical difficulties for wheelchair users, to have ramps so that they can easily access all physical areas, including toilets, which very often is a problem. If a child is using some kind of other mobility device, then to have rails and ramps in the toilet so that they can actually get some support to use the toilet. Similarly, the kind of taps you would make so that they are not the ones which are hard for somebody with a motor difficulty who finds it hard to turn the knob of the tap. It may be better to have those which have a lever which just raise up or raise down to switch it on and off. Some of those may be more specifically because children are learning independence and mobility, so they may be also required to provide that additional support. And for example, one of the most interesting examples I saw, and it was so interesting because it was so simple. So this was a school which had included children with visual difficulties in their classroom. What they had done is they had put a rope from the classroom right up to the toilet, and where there was a step, there was a knot in the rope, so the child would know that. So by feeling that rope along the way, the child could actually independently access the classroom. Now it may be a very simple thing that, okay, if the child needs help to go to the toilet, why doesn't somebody go with this child? But it's such an important learning aspect and such an important issue of one's own personal dignity and sense of competence to be able to do this independently. And I thought this was such a beautiful example of how, in a very simple way, if you're thinking from the perspective of the child, one can actually provide these kind of supports within that school, which is including children with disabilities. The other whole aspect is how we prepare teachers. We know now that there are pedagogical approaches, ways of teaching learning, using group work with children. You divide children according to their interest and also their abilities, and actually the teacher is able to manage even a relatively larger classroom with some support to make sure that children with of different abilities have that additional support. Of course, here we're not talking of classrooms with 60 children to a teacher or 180 children to a teacher, which sometimes is the case in developing countries. But certainly in a reasonable class size it is, and with the right support and training, teachers can manage a lot of disabilities.
We also need to look beyond the school when thinking about inclusivity. Disabled children are often actively prevented from accessing education by the attitudes and decisions of their families. Divya insists that the family and community must be on board for inclusive education to work.
We know, of course, early childhood is now gaining a lot of importance, and by early childhood I mean really supporting children right from the start, from usually we say from 0 to 8. So providing that very early support, especially in the very early years when the child is still at home and with the family and parents, it's so important to provide that support, because good early childhood experience actually increases the probability that, first of all, the impairment the child is facing does not become a severe disability. I think the sooner we catch these situations and we can begin to provide assistive support to the child, then the less the impact of the impairment. Secondly, it also increases the chances that the child will thrive better in an inclusive setting. A child who's had, let's say, early support, let's say if I have a hearing difficulty and it has been caught fairly early, particularly within the first 6 months of life, and I've had appropriate intervention in that regard, then my hearing and also the language development, which very often is very highly correlated with how well I hear, that will also be on track. So those kind of interventions really make a difference to successful in inclusive settings. So I would say these things, if they can be built into our systems, then definitely children will thrive very well in inclusive settings, and I would definitely vote for that.
What about the non-disabled children who are there already? Surely they have a large role to play in the creation of an inclusive educational environment.
One of the most important things is to build this culture of acceptance of difference and really celebrating the diversity that we all bring. The second thing is to build systems within learning settings where children can actually help each other. There are buddy systems, like if you're going from one classroom to the other, if a child needs help, then how do you create systems so that actually it builds in that in a systemic way. And the third thing I would say is that sometimes probably, there may be certain conditions where children need to understand that why my classmate behaves in a certain way. So maybe a little bit of an orientation also to what to expect in these sort of situations. And once we understand and we begin to, explore that a little bit more, then it becomes easier to really play that role of being a positive influence on a peer who may be having a difficulty with something.
Every child has a right to be supported by their parents and community to grow, learn, and develop in their early years, and upon reaching school age, to go to school and be welcomed and included by teachers and peers. When all children, regardless of their differences, are educated together, they learn to appreciate diversity. Everyone benefits, and there is evidence that it also improves learning outcomes for non-disabled children.